Anglo-Saxon Boy, Chapter 2. Surrounded by enemies. There was always a buzz of pleasure about the place when the Earl returned to his hall, especially if he had been away long. He was a ring-giver, a generous lord to his warriors, and a good provider to everyone else. Nobody ever went hungry in the service of Harold Godwinson, not even the lowliest peasant or slave, in the years when the harvest was bad. But Magnus knew there was more to it than that. People served his father because they loved him, not because of what he gave them. The Earl was also their only source of justice. The people of the farm started lining up while he was still eating, begging him to listen to their complaints against others or settle disputes. Later in the morning, people from Bossum and the neighbouring settlements started to arrive, and soon the hall was packed with a large, noisy crowd, all clamouring to be heard. Magnus found himself being elbowed out of the way again, and guessed his father would wait for a moment to speak to him. But his mother had little patience with the crowd, and quickly lost her temper. "Enough!" she yelled. "Hakon, clear these people out so the Earl can rest." Hakon swiftly did as he was ordered, organising the other housecarls to help him with the task. They pushed and shoved the crowd to the doorway and beyond, and before long the hall was more peaceful, just a few servants and the family remaining. Yet Magnus hung back, watching his brothers and sisters as they took their chance to chat to their father, boasting about what they had been doing since he had last seen them, competing for his attention like a pack of overexcited puppies. "I've been practising with the bow you gave me, father," said Godwin. He was the firstborn, named for their grandfather, 2 years older than Magnus, and the one who looked most like their mother. "Yesterday I hit the target 10 times out of 10. "Don't listen to him, father, he's lying," said Edmund, the second child. He was a year older than Magnus, but dark and stocky. People said that showed the family must have some Welsh blood somewhere in its past. Godwin shoved him, and Edmund shoved back, but they soon stopped when their father gave them a look. "Did you bring me the necklace you promised, father?" Githa said sweetly. She was 2 years younger than Magnus, and named after their grandmother Githa, who still lived. The younger Githa was set to be a golden-haired beauty too. "If Githa gets a necklace, I want one as well," said 10-year-old Gunhild, the youngest. She was the most mixed of them all, sometimes looking like their mother, sometimes their father, although like Magnus her hair was copper-coloured. "I'm sure there will be something for you in my saddlebags," said their father, laughing and squeezing Gunhild's cheek. "What about you, Magnus?" Magnus uneasily met his father's gaze, trying to think of an achievement he could boast about, and failing. He shrugged, and wondered if he should simply ask what his father wanted of him, but this didn't seem the right time or place. He didn't get the opportunity in any case, for just then Hakon returned to the hall. "My lord, more people have come to speak to you," he said. "They won't take no for an answer either. What do you want me to do with them?" "Let them in," said the Earl. "Duty calls, children. We'll talk more later." He was kept busy for the rest of that day, and the next day turned out to be even worse. By late evening, Magnus had decided his father must have changed his mind about speaking to him, and tried not to think about it any more. But he couldn't sleep, and lay awake in the chamber he shared with his brothers, both of whom were snoring deeply. Suddenly Hakon appeared in the doorway and beckoned to him. "Your father will see you now, Magnus," the housecarl said quietly. Magnus rose and followed Hakon through the darkened hall. The fire in the central hearth had been allowed to die down for the night, and the floor beside the walls was lined with the humped shapes of sleeping servants and housecarls. Hakon and Magnus came at last to a large chamber at the rear of the hall, the place where the family documents and treasures were stored in chests. The chamber was lit by a dozen tall candles, the kind that always made Magnus think of church. His father was sitting on a stool, studying a scroll, and looked up. "Thank you, Hakon," he said. The housecarl nodded and slipped away back into the shadows of the hall. Somewhere in the night outside an owl hooted, and Magnus had a brief vision in his mind of the bird swooping down to seize a tiny mouse in its sharp talons. "Sit down, Magnus," said the Earl. "Do you know what this document is?" Magnus pulled up a stool and peered at the parchment, which was covered with lines and words. He had been taught to read by monks, as all noble children were. His brothers had always grumbled about it. They couldn't see the point and were only interested in lessons that involved sword and spear and shield. But Magnus had enjoyed acquiring the skill, and he had seen other documents like this. "It's a map, father," he said. "It shows Britain and the lands nearby." His father smiled. "Good. So you know this is England, the kingdom of the Angles and the Saxons, Wessex here in the south, Mercia and East Anglia across the middle, Northumbria beyond. We English rule most of Britain, but we're surrounded by enemies, and the day is coming when they might attack. King Edward will die soon, and the wolves are gathering. Many men think they should sit on his throne." Magnus had heard such things before. The monks who had taught him to read had taught him about the past too. So he knew that Britain had been fought over for hundreds of years. The Romans had taken it from the Welsh, built their great cities of stone, then left them to fall into ruins, and Britain to the Welsh once more. Then the Angles and Saxons had come from across the sea and founded their own kingdoms, penning the Welsh into the western mountains. There had been wars with the Scots and in the far north, and the Irish had raided from their own island. The Angles and Saxons had fought amongst themselves, each kingdom struggling to rule the others. After that, the Vikings came, mostly from Denmark. They too began as raiders, but they seized land and started to settle, almost turning the east and north completely Danish. The Godwins were part of Danish, Grandmother Githa being from a noble Danish family. King Alfred of Wessex defeated the Danes at last, and his grandson Athelstan united the Angles and Saxons, and even the Danes who had settled into the kingdom of England. But there were still raids and wars, big and small. "Perhaps King Edward will live longer than everyone thinks and have a son to succeed him," said Magnus. "That would make a difference, wouldn't it?" His father frowned and shook his head. "It was your grandfather's dream for a Godwin to sit on the throne, one of his descendants. That's why he persuaded Edward to marry my sister. It seemed the easiest way, but they've been husband and wife for years, and they've had no children." "So who will succeed him then, father? You must have some idea." "It could be any one of half a dozen men with claims to the throne. Or it could be me," the Earl smiled. "Don't look so surprised, Magnus. I have plenty of supporters. Everyone knows England needs a strong ruler now more than ever. And the truth is that Edward already depends on me to run his kingdom. But making a bid for the throne of England won't be easy, and I will need your help to make sure I don't fail." Magnus realised his mouth was open, and he quickly shut it. His mind was reeling with surprise, yet the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. He was sure his father would make a magnificent King of England. Nobody would be better. He was a great warrior, and full of wisdom too. But what can I do?" Magnus stammered. "I'm no good at anything." "That's not true, Magnus. You did well on the war trail, and I've no doubt you're going to be a fine warrior. You've also got more brains than both your brothers put together. I've seen you watching and listening while they chatter. You keep your own counsel. You know when to speak and when to stay silent. So will you help me? Remember, if I am king, I will need an heir, and I can choose who I please." Magnus sat still for a moment, hardly able to believe what he had heard. How strange it felt to be there with his father talking of such important things. He thought of all the times when he had asked himself what his destiny might be, and now he knew. A sudden draught made the candles flicker, and Magnus shivered. He wondered if the ghost of his grandfather was there in the chamber with them too. "I am yours to command, father," Magnus said. "Do what you will with me." And just like that, with a few words, he changed his life forever.